Alright, we're going to get underway here with a game of Revised 40. This is my first game in the March 2020 League that's taking place on one of the Magic Facebook groups. I roll a 5 on the left there, and my opponent Mike S. on the right side rolls an 8, so he'll be on the play. So Mike S. on the right there draws his 7 cards. Looks at him, decides to keep, and puts 1 to the bottom. And he is first, so he leads with a swamp. I draw my card for the turn and lead with an island, trying to set up a turn 2 counterspell. Mike, passing it back to Mike S, goes for the turn 2 Dredge Skeletons, which is the 1/1 creature that can regenerate itself for a black. He does have a third land there, but thankfully I've got the double blue up now with those 2 islands to potentially counter a spell. Dredge Skeletons getting in for 1 there. On my turn I play a Plains as my land for the turn, and I pass back to Mike, who swings for 1, putting me down to 18. He does have 4 lands, but he doesn't decide to use them on anything, and he passes back to me. I play an island for the turn and pass it back. Mike, drawing his second color, he plays a mountain for the turn, and he decides to use it, paying 3 mana for his Uthden Troll. So I go for the counterspell there with Power Sink, which is a strangely worded card, but pretty much it's countered unless he pays X, where X is 3 in this case. And if he can't pay, he has to tap all of his lands and spend all unspent mana. So in a format with mana burn, that can sometimes be relevant. Here he can dump his swamps into the Dredge Skeletons so that he avoids taking mana burn and swings for 1. Sometimes if you power sink though, it can come up where your opponent has to tap a large amount of lands and take a lot of damage from the unspent mana. So I miss my 5th land drop and pass it back to Mike S. Missing lands is not what you want to be doing in Control. You want to be getting to more mana and having more efficient threats than your opponent. So my opponent goes for a Sedge Troll, and I have a second copy of Power Sink to counter it. Unfortunately for me, Mike S has the Dark Ritual. So X is 3 for Power Sink. Dark Ritual, of course, adds 3 mana, so he's able to pay for my Power Sink. Sedge Troll resolves, and he gets in for 1. Passing back to me, I draw my card for the turn. And I am still missing my 5th land drop, it looks like. Which is very unfortunate for me. A lot of the cool plays in blue-white control happen at 5 mana. Plays like Serra Angel, big Brain Geysers, things like that. So I pass it back to Mike, who plays a land for the turn and gets in for 4, putting me down to 12. Sedge Troll, of course, has the static ability. It's a 2/2 that has an additional +1/+1 if its controller has a swamp in play, which my opponent has plenty of. So I find my 5th land for the turn, but it is not a Plains, unfortunately, so I can't run out anything like a Serra or anything double white. My opponent plays a mountain as their land for the turn. And he decides to attack me for another 4, putting me down to 8. So I'm still looking for that second white source. I do have some copies of Wrath of God in my deck, but it doesn't do very much against my opponent's board over there. So my opponent goes for a Disintegrate, which is an X-costing burn spell, where it deals X damage to you. Thankfully, I do have the counterspell, though. So the Disintegrate over there is countered. And I untap and draw my card for the turn. And still don't draw the Plains. This is really looking bad for me over on the left there. So I pass it back to Mike. He thinks about his options for a minute and swings for 4. And it looks like I did draw the Swords to Plowshares, which is going to handle the Sedge Troll. Sedge Troll does have the ability to regenerate, but not from a Swords to Plowshares, since it does exile the creature. So Mike S gets in for 1, putting me down to 7, and follows it up with a Hypnotic Spectre, which I thankfully have a second copy of Counterspell for. Hypnotic Spectre, very bad for a control player. You do not want to be discarding cards from your hand. Still missing that second Plains, I pass it back to Mike S, who plays a Swamp and gets in for another 1. I draw my card for the turn, and finally I have access to double white. So you can see I immediately there run out my Serra Angel, which is a 4/4 flyer with Vigilance that can easily block a Drudge Skeleton. So I finally have a way to stop the damage coming from Mike S's board. Mike pays double red and double black for a Pestilence, which can kind of act like a sweeper in this case, if he so chooses. Pestilence is very bad for me at this state. I am at 6 life, and Pestilence does hit players as well. So Mike could put me to 1 if he chose to at the moment. And Pestilence does resolve. I don't have the double blue for Counterspell, unfortunately. So Pestilence interacts really well with regenerating creatures like his Drudge Skeleton. He can essentially just pay a black mana, deal 1 damage to everything, and then regenerate his creature, keeping it around. Pestilence does leave play if there are no creatures in play, so he can use his regenerate to not only save his creatures, but also keep Pestilence in play. You can see that Wrath of God in my hand there doing absolutely nothing. So Mike S still thinking about what to do. Going for the 1 mana for Pestilence, dealing 1 damage to all creatures and all players, and using another black to regenerate his skeleton from that. He puts another black into Pestilence, dealing another 1 to everything, and regenerates his skeleton again, and passes the turn back to me. So I get in for 4 with my Vigilance Serra Angel. And I pay 2 for the Disenchant. Probably the cleanest answer to Pestilence that there can be, except for a Counterspell. And I pass the turn back to Mike. So it's important to remember that Regenerate does tap the creature when the Regenerate shield breaks. So that's why his Drudge Skeletons was tapped. It still wouldn't be able to block the Serra Angel, but some people do forget Regenerate does tap the creature. So I get in for 4 with my Serra Angel, putting my opponent to 13 on the right there. And I pay 5 mana for a Brain Geyser, targeting myself, so I'm going to draw 3 cards. I don't have a counterspell in my hand at this point, so I try to Brain Geyser into 1 in case my opponent over there on the right draws another copy of Pestilence, which would be lethal at this point. Which, they did have the second Pestilence. Thankfully, though, I did find a counterspell off of that Brain Geyser and left the double blue open to cast it. So that's why I didn't pay the full mana into Brain Geyser. On my turn, I get in for 4 damage to my opponent on the right there. And thinking about what to do here, I pay 5 mana for a second copy of Serra Angel. And I pass the turn. This will speed up the clock by a good margin. It's now a 2-turn clock instead of a 1-turn clock. So I get in for 8, putting my opponent down to 1. Looks at the top of his deck. And it's a Hypnotic Spectre, which does not get there. So I take down the first game on the left there, and we move to game number 2. So Mike S on the right there decides to keep their mulligan and bottoms a card, and leads with a mountain. I play an island as my land for the turn, pass it back to Mike, who plays a swamp. He does have enough mana to run out a Drudge Skeleton or something like that, so let's see if he has it. So Mike goes for the Dark Ritual, adding 3 to his pool, along with a red from his mountain, and uses it to cast a Sedge Troll. The 2/2 turned 3/3 since he has a swamp in play. He does have 1 black mana left over, so he takes 1 from Mana Burn. He could have used that black to put a regeneration shield on the Sedge Troll, so small misplay there, but it doesn't end up mattering. So Mike gets in for 3 damage, and I have the Swords to Plowshares to answer the Sedge Troll. Sedge Troll, of course, cannot regenerate from a sword since it does exile the creature. So Mike S on the right there gains life equal to its power, which is 3, putting him up to 22. I play another Plains as my land for the turn. Not really where I want to be. Ideally, I like to have 2 islands in play to counter spells. My opponent plays a Navineral's Disc, which is one of the better sweepers in Revised 40. Thankfully, end of turn, I do have the Disenchant to answer it. And Mike S passes back to me. I miss my 4th land drop and just pass it back. Again, missing my land drops, not good for the control deck. Mike S on the right there, still going full throttle though. He has not missed a land drop yet, so he's on 5 lands. We'll see if he has a troll to put pressure on my life total. And he does not, he just passes the turn back. So hoping to draw that 4th land there on my side. I'm looking at my options and I just pass the turn. Very unfortunate for me to miss 2 land drops in a row. So back to my opponent on the right with now 6 mana available. Most of the creatures in his deck do cost 3, so it'd be very bad for me if he were to run out 2 of them. So he pays 6 and casts a Disintegrate, targeting me for 5 damage. Disintegrate goes through and resolves, taking me down to 15 life, and he passes back to me. I do find my 4th land and play a Jayemdae Tome, one of the best card drawing engines in Old School and Revised 40. I can pay 4 and tap to draw an extra card. My opponent on their turn goes with a Hypnotic Spectre, so he will be trying to put pressure on the amount of cards that I have in hand. A pretty nice answer to the Jayemdae Tome. I do have the Serra Angel on the left, though, which is a 4/4 flyer, so it blocks the Hypnotic Spectre pretty well. Passing back to my opponent. I'm a bit worried about a Lightning Bolt here, finishing off my Serra Angel of it with a Hypnotic Spectre attack, but thankfully my opponent doesn't have it, so I'm able to get in for 4. Passing back to Mike S on the right there. Serra Angel's a good answer to Hypnotic Spectre since it does have Vigilance, so I can use it as an attacker and a blocker. So Mike S goes for an Uthden Troll on the right there, one of the regenerating trolls, which is pretty good for him. He can use it to put pressure on my life total. If I do play ground creatures, he can use it to block. So he passes the turn, and end of turn I decide to draw a card off of the Jayemdae Tome by paying 4, and using my last plains to cast Swords to Plowshares on his Hypnotic Spectre, gaining him 2 life, putting him back at 20. Going back to my turn, I attack for 4, putting my opponent on the right there at 16, and passing the turn back. With this Jayemdae Tome in play, I can essentially sit on counterspells and just wait to react to my opponent, since if I don't have anything to do, I just draw a card off of the Jayemdae Tome. My guess goes for a Drudge Skeletons, the 1/1 regenerating creature. So you can see lots of regeneration on my opponent's side. Really, really good against ground attacks. Not as good against Swords to Plowshares, which is a factor in this matchup. So I hit him for 4 with the Serra Angel, putting him at 12. And play a second Serra Angel. This is absolutely brutal. So this turns my 3-turn clock into a 2-turn clock. And my opponent goes for a 3rd regenerating creature, another Uthden Troll. The 2/2 regenerating troll by paying a red. Passing back to me, I look at my options and get in for 8, putting my opponent on the right there down to 4. Unfortunately, none of the trolls have flying, so they can't be used to block Serras and regenerate. And that's the game. So record stands at 2-0. Definitely most valuable cards in this matchup, Serra Angel and the many counterspells from the blue-white deck. So let's take a closer look at our MVPs for this game. Serra Angel definitely winning the game for the control deck this time, being a 4/4 with flying. It's really hard to block. And honorable mentions, we have Counterspell and Pestilence. Counterspell helping to keep opposing threats off the table, and Pestilence threatening both creatures and just lethal damage. If you do want to see deck text for either of these decks or more games of Revised 40, be sure to check out the Revised 40 playlist. Alright, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.